Hi, and welcome to Module 3. Yes, male is a gender too. Often when we think about the word gender, we may assume that we will be exploring the non-normative gender position, in this case, women, in comparison to the kind of dominant male norm. However, in the past several years, following on feminist scholarship, a growing body of work has begun to explore the understandings of masculinity and how men and women, and all those within the spectrum of gender, are positioned in the world, individually and in relation to one another. So while we've explored issues of power and gender, where women and those not normatively male are most likely to be excluded in educational organizations, in Module 2, in this module we'll explore the other end of the spectrum, masculinity and its privileges and challenges in educational organizations. First though, let's consider upcoming assignments. First, in this module, you'll be reconsidering a reflection thread from either Forum 1 or 2. That is, you will reconsider the whole thread in light of deeper understandings of the issues raised in the literature, as well as the discussion on your thread, and any implications that has for leadership in schools. A video has been posted with more detail and where to post your assignment and so on. I also want to mention the other two upcoming assignments. The first is an artifact video assignment in which you will identify an artifact in your work environment that demonstrates the ways in which gender organizes practices in schools. And by artifact, I mean something that's real, a list on a wall, a table, the way a room is arranged, a display cabinet, a sign on a door, whatever it happens to be. I've posted some examples of what people have done in the past that might give you some ideas. And if you haven't already done so, start thinking about what you might consider exploring in the context of your workplace. And if you're stuck, let me know and we can work on some ideas. I have more information in the same video that I've already mentioned. I also wanted to note that you can pick up on the ideas you've begun to explore in your video in more depth in your final paper in Module 5. You don't have to do so, but it's a good way to explore a topic in as much depth as possible when you're in a compressed course, and it may help you use your time more efficiently as well. So I'll leave that up to you, but we can talk about that if you wish. When we look at these pictures, we see some examples of a significant disruption of gender roles and their implications both in terms of the larger society, and here we have some pictures of the Women's March. You may remember it from only 3 years ago after Trump's inauguration, when millions protested what he had signaled throughout the campaign about women and minorities through his words and actions and the likely direction of policy around women and women's bodies. So the march was in response to that. We have men and women speaking out on behalf of women and gender justice that includes men as gender roles are reconsidered. And all of this has implications for boys and girls in schools and in our practices in schools. We have young people taking up issues of equity and speaking out in a way that, honestly, I could not have imagined or predicted. So the moment we are in is one of change, challenges that threaten to move society back to familiar patterns that created the inequity in the first place, but also social action and resistance in support of social change that will bring greater equity for all. As we consider what all of this means for males, you'll all be watching some videos about boys and their struggles with stereotypes, and they're listed in the readings and videos in Module 3. And also we'll be considering articles by authors from the UK and Australia. Judith Gill is professor in School of Education at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. Peter Arnold was a research assistant at the same university and was a principal for several years in various locations in Australia, and they did this work together. Mark McCormick is a professor of sociology at Roehampton University in London, UK. He has a deep involvement in the academic world through heading centers around masculinity and sexuality, which is his area of expertise, as well as publishing widely in both academic and popular circles. For example, in addition to a really large body of academic publications, it's impressive, he has published in The Economist, Huffington Post, and appeared on BBC Radio and even Q on CBC. And last we have Bob Lingard, who is at the School of Education at the University of Queensland, Wayne Martino, an Australian who is now at Western in Ontario, and you'll hear him mentioned actually in the Kimmel video, and Martin Mills, also at the School of Education at the University of Queensland. Each one has focused a lifetime of work on various equity and gender issues in educational contexts. In the last module, we talked about gender stereotypes, and while they can be challenged and resisted, they do have significant implications in girls' and women's lives, and in men's and boys' lives. We also talked about how social and economic reorganization, including in schools, intersected with these stereotypical understandings of how gender was performed by us each day in ways that were detrimental to girls' educational opportunities and women's career aspirations. But I think we can say the same for boys and men in very particular kinds of ways, and we'll explore that in this module. When talking about masculinity and schooling in this module, McCormick and Lingard refer to stereotypes as hegemonic. In this case, hegemonic masculinity. That is, our actions are enacted often subconsciously in response to normative expectations around gender, which are reinforced and perpetuated all around us through both the hidden curriculum in schools, the everyday informal interactions in schools, as well as the structural impacts of schooling through curricula, policies, rules, and regulations, and of course in the broader society as well. As a result, students engage with these expectations and stereotypes embedded in school life and negotiate their gendered identity within them. This is a dynamic and not entirely predictable process, of course. As we saw in the video in Module 1, students may conform, resist, ignore, sometimes, never, always, in very complex ways. And those of you who are working with young people all the time know that's exactly the way it is. Many years ago, as the world shifted from one built on community and relational values to one that was becoming industrialized and bureaucratized, Max Weber considered how the informal and especially the formal expectations of those engaged in public and industrialized institutions had changed. He called this phenomenon the iron cage. He was attempting to describe in a metaphorical way the ways in which an increasingly rationalized and bureaucratized society was dominated by technical rational rules that governed interactions in workplaces and social institutions, all of which were becoming less and less about human values and more about organizational needs. The result, he observed, was a break in human relationality through the steady rise of bureaucracies and the need within capitalism to acquire rather than make, share, or barter for things in order to maintain the new economy. This shifting social economic world may explain the increasing reliance on stereotypes, especially in a world that seemed fraught with danger and fear of change, rather than more unpredictable relationships to maintain a reliable social order. Just to review our previous discussion about stereotypes in Module 2, the dictionary definition states that a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a person or thing. Gender stereotypes have become what some sociologists refer to as a man box. In fact, Kimmel talks about that. Or as Charles Glickman wrote, the act like a man box. Or, of course, there's an act like a woman box too. So let's look at what they are. And this kind of builds on what we talked about in the last module. So when you're talking about acting like a man box, what are some of the expectations that are privileged if you're male or privileged if you're female? Well, if you're a male, if you're handsome, strong, stoic, rational, tough, powerful, you have status and money, you're good at sports, you're sexually attractive, and you're straight, then you're going to do okay. If you're a woman, if you're pretty, kind of fragile, in response to a strong man, emotive, emotional, caring, have deference to the powerful, dependent, or contributing to those who have status and money and, kind of keep you in a way. If you're fit, sexually attractive, and straight, then you're acting like a woman in a way that's going to gain you privilege. Note that there is no box for those who cannot conform to either the man or woman box, which can be a lonely and sometimes dangerous place to be, one that McCormick describes so well. As we've discussed before, and as the videos you'll watch for this module demonstrate, these stereotypes, which are of course lived out in very complex ways, and the videos talk to these as well, have significant power as a kind of shorthand in shaping practices, policies, and popular discourse around schools, schooling, and the informal relations in schools across the gender spectrum. But they can also be, and of course are, resisted. So what does all this have to do with gender, leadership, and schooling? As it turns out, quite a bit. Schools are agencies of cultural reproduction, and you've probably heard that before in courses that you've taken. But they can also be agencies of social change, and you've probably heard that as well. That is, they can be places where gender norms are reproduced, but also questioned and transformed. In this module, we're going to look at that process in 3 specific areas. First, we'll look at McCormick's rather sobering discussion about the school lives of teenage boys. And the ways in which male norms shape how they respond to protecting themselves through the adoption of behaviors that can often be destructive, aggressive, and even homophobic. And yet in schools that encourage wider expressions of that masculinity, may be far more open to one another, less aggressive, and enact more equitable practices. And he actually talks about that later in the book. Second, in 2 chapters from their co-written book, Lingard et al. Consider how male teachers are positioned in schools across the grades and subject areas, and why these patterns have persisted. They also respond to the notion of single-sex classrooms for boys as a potential solution to the so-called boy problem. And last, Gill and Arnold look at how gendered expectations position male principals in a time of emotionally charged educational change. It's important to note that all of these authors consider the complexities of the issues they explore in light of informal influences in education, the hidden curriculum, relationships between various players, and so on, as well as the more formal influences such as, such as curricula, policies, regulations, and so on. Indeed, they argue that schools are influenced by gender and act upon gender in complex ways. Boys in schools represent a broad range of experiences and needs. They come to school at the intersection of race, class, socioeconomic status, geographic location, cultural norms, sexual orientation, interests, abilities, and so on. McCormick argues, however, that hegemonic masculinity is a powerful force in the processes of exclusion and inclusion that boys employ to maintain what he calls heteromasculine privilege, or the privilege that is gained in enacting dominant male stereotypes. And again, the videos take this up in interesting ways as well. Doing so, of course, excludes non-stereotypical boys as well as girls in preserving privilege within a kind of hypermasculine hierarchy. The mechanisms for doing so are sexist and homophobic language, and bullying, even violence at times, is used, whether in fact the recipient is homosexual or perceived as effeminate, to prove their manly heterosexuality. They may also work to associate themselves with the athletes and jocks that are at the top of the masculine hierarchy, so that by association at least they can protect themselves from the threat of exclusion or bullying and that sort of thing. He argues that in a system where masculinity is often acceptable within stereotypical norms, these responses by boys in schools are inevitable. Change, then, requires that schools open up opportunities for the expression of multiple masculinities, and later in the book discusses his discovery of a school where this is the norm, and the ways in which a more full expression of masculinity enabled male students to accept one another in very surprising ways that were not as elitist, competitive, or inequitable, that crossed those boundaries between the different kinds of boys in schools. In other words, it's possible, and some schools are working to be places of transformation around gender issues. As both of the Lingard and colleagues articles and McCormick article demonstrate, hegemonic notions of masculinity are at the heart of current discussions about so-called failing boys and the various solutions offered, and Kimmel discusses this in his video as well. The most popular of these options is men in teaching, often with a preference for real men who are able to discipline, in quotes, naughty boys, as the Lingard and his colleagues article suggests, as well as boy-only classrooms where boys can escape the so-called pressure of high-performing girls, and it's believed can be taught in a style that is perceived to suit boys best. Again, Kimmel looks at this, and the discussion is very interesting, especially in light of the Kimmel et al. Article. These solutions that are argued by Lingard and his colleagues are essentialist and simplistic, assuming a one-size-fits-all notion of masculinity in both teachers and students that has done little to shift gender norms. Further, these simplistic ideas don't ask questions about which boys are failing or which men need to be teaching in order to improve results for middle-class students from the dominant cultural group. So while there is some evidence to show that minority boys benefit from having a male teacher from their cultural group, research does not support the notion that simply matching a male student with a male teacher is going to resolve the so-called boy problem. And here are a couple of articles from I think these were both from The Guardian, that talks about how governments were trying to push these agendas forward around single-sex classrooms and more male teachers as a solution. But as Kimmel argues in the video, and as Lingard demonstrates in the article, these are not solutions at all. Instead, by homogenizing the category boy, hegemonic masculinity is not challenged, nor are homophobic behaviors questioned. In fact, as Matt Pinkett in this article from The Guardian suggests, and Lingard and his colleagues corroborate in their research, stereotypical masculinity is at odds with academic achievement. So if that's the case, then this would help explain why some boys don't achieve their academic potential unless they're provided with an opportunity to interpret masculinity more broadly. That is, as Lingard and his colleagues argue, if single-sex pedagogy organizes learning based on a belief in stereotypical masculine norms, then it simply perpetuates harmful patterns of interaction by not calling this connection between stereotypical masculinity and learning into question. And therefore, it doesn't offer boys the opportunity to explore broader forms of masculinity or offer a space to those boys who already express their masculinity in non-traditional ways. Alternatively, teachers like Matt Pinkett and some of the teachers in the case studies in the Lingard and colleagues article offer an alternative approach that challenges stereotypes and provides a broader repertoire of masculinities. In doing so, they break the link between the real mankind of masculinity being at odds with academic achievement and open up a broader range of opportunities to engage with schooling opportunities. And here's Matt Pinkett that I referred to, and what he said is exactly what I've been saying, that thinking that this was going to solve problems, of course, didn't. And he had to rethink how he was looking at this. He says, I thought things would be different in Devon, but it's not so different. It's not all to do with class. There's also this anti-school mindset fueled by stereotypical masculinity, like the stereotype that schoolwork is something girls naturally do best, he says. And Kimmel picks up on that as well. So to conclude, gender expression within the constraints of stereotypical male norms affects the work of male principals too. For the past 3 decades, principals have been caught up at least the past 3 decades, principals have been caught up in a fast-moving vortex of structural and curricular and organizational change that has shifted power and responsibility between the government, board, and principal's office. As a result, the work of being a principal has been made more complex for male principals because they're caught between the emotional demands of the job and gendered expectations. So Gill and her colleague talk about these male principals, particularly one in a position of authority, feel that they need to appear to be in control, despite inner feelings of uncertainty, confusion, frustration, and so on. Gill and Arnold, quoting a participant in their research, say, if I show too much emotion, I'm weak and unprofessional. But you've got to show emotion to people. You've got to show them something of what you're feeling. Otherwise, people think you don't care. So on the one hand, they're being told not to display emotion. On the other hand, they feel that they must in order to be able to create a sympathetic environment for those who are coming to the school and the parents who are concerned about all of the changes. They also talk about women who have often been positioned as the emotional laborers in the school because of, again, sex stereotypes. And unless they set boundaries around this stereotypical norm, they can be overwhelmed by this role and the demands of their job, or they can be censured if they display too much emotion. So it's a very complex location. So in terms of male principles, we see the effects of a shifting gender order and a resulting discomfort when work demands stand in contrast to what is expected of men. Again, Gill and Arnold's work challenges stereotypes and offers another model of leadership for men that opens up wider possibilities for leadership and for gender. And as they open up that opportunity, so do the readings for boys in schools. And so I hope that you'll enjoy the readings and the videos. Learn. Not all of it is uncontroversial, of course. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion about what's being put forward here. So enjoy the readings, enjoy the videos. I know I'll enjoy the forum, and all the best.